Hello students, welcome. This is Mr. Lewandowski. We're going to be talking about some different understandings about reading today. Harold Bloom's and Ursula K. Le Guin's. Harold Bloom, cranky, elitist, Ivy League professor. Ursula K. Le Guin, earthy, science fiction author, cool lady. They're both no longer with us, but they're both important to me right now. Because they're going to help you on a journey that I think will be awesome. It's actually going to go on for some weeks, probably 20 videos at least, if not more. Because during this journey, we are going to investigate some of the greatest literature ever written. And they're going to help us. They're going to help us because they are almost totally opposite in how they think one should approach what is worth reading. But they are united in that nobody speaks as beautifully about the power and value of literature than Harold Bloom, except for maybe Ursula K. Le Guin, who does so in a different, more charming, more approachable, more kind way. I don't agree with everything that either one of them says, but in this video, I'm going to set the groundwork for what's going to be quite a journey. It's going to take us into the canon. This is a piece of writing by Harold Bloom, an elegy for the canon, because the canon is not it's not very popular idea right now. The idea that there is one set of literature, one set of works that are placed above all in Western civilization, if we look at the foundation of humankind. And he argues in defense of the canon very eloquently. I don't agree with everything, but it's cool to think about. I'm going to talk about that, some of the ideas that are worth examining from this piece of writing called Elegy for the Canon. And then we're going to switch gears and we're going to talk a little bit about Ursula K. Le Guin. And Ursula K. Le Guin looks at the value of literature from a totally different perspective. They're both going to help us get the most from our experience as we take a little trip that's going to take 7 weeks through Beowulf, written before English existed in 800 AD. Barely. It's kind of like it's got one foot in the pagan world, 1 foot in the Christian world. The first word of Beowulf is what, which some people have translated to sow. Some people have translated to hark or listen. We're going to read a brand new translation that Harold Bloom would hate. Harold Bloom, traditionalist, tradition, with a big capital T in a way that's, I don't know, I want to call it mean-spirited, because he was like a guy who would cry. You know, he would read Milton's poetry and start crying. He would talk about the power of literature and just start gushing tears. But they were like, you know, those kind of like weird masculine tears? That's Harold Bloom. Ursula K. Le Guin, I'm sure, would also be happy to cry. But she was much more open and flexible in what she considered valuable literature. Harold Bloom was really a jerk, like an elitist jerk, but he was really smart, and he really valued especially the stuff that we're going to be reading. Ursula K. Le Guin was also smart, eloquent, kind, big-hearted. The translation that we're going to read of Beowulf, Bloom would have hated because it's brand new and it's a feminist translation. So the author has translated that first word, which is an Old English word, so you can translate it however you think is appropriate. The word is what. She translated it to bro, and she envisions Beowulf very much as like a dudes telling other dudes how awesome they are, and it's kind of it's a bit of a mess. And it's also not as sophisticated as what follows. So we'll read Beowulf first, the first part of Beowulf. Then we'll read the first part of Ovid. We'll read some chunks of Ovid, which is more sophisticated, much more sophisticated, because this was written at the height or at the early emergence of the Roman Empire, when Ovid had at his disposal all the learning the Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, and the great Greek rhetoricians, people who study rhetoric, Cicero. And so it's eloquent, it's layered, it's complex. And so we have Beowulf, which is kind of like a bunch of dudes bumbling about trying to kill a monster, talking about how much beer they can drink. And then we have sophisticated Ovid, which is translated from Latin, a very good translation. Then we have Chaucer, Chaucer has some of Ovid's characters. Chaucer read Ovid in Latin. And as he was working to invent the English language, he was part of that process. He wrote in Middle English. We can barely sort of almost understand Chaucer when we try to read Chaucer, 1390. And then some of the same characters are going to emerge in A Midsummer Night's Dream by Shakespeare, who Bloom would say Shakespeare is the pinnacle. Like nobody has surpassed Shakespeare and Shakespeare's ability to do what literature has the power to do, which he says is basically invent us. So I'm going to read some Harold Bloom. I'm going to talk about some of his ideas. And then I'm going to do the same with Ursula K. Le Guin. And that will be our learning for today. And then we'll proceed to get into Beowulf. You'll learn how to read that epic poetry. You'll learn how to see metaphors, personifications. You'll learn how to dissect the narrator's position, how stories are told. It's going to be, I think it's going to be really fun. I'm really looking forward to it. It's going to bring me a lot of joy. I hope it brings you some joy as well. Originally, the canon meant the choice of books in our teaching institutions. And despite the recent politics of multiculturalism, the canon's true question remains: what shall the individual who still desires to read attempt to read this late in history? Bloom is not a fan of the politics of multiculturalism. So in that way, you could say he's a bit of a hero to the conservative movement here in the United States, which pushes against especially multicultural, like, critical theories. I don't think that Bloom was like racist or sexist, although I think he was often accused of being racist or sexist. He just felt that multiculturalism didn't have a place in literary criticism. Not a moment passes these days without fresh rushes of academic lemmings off the cliffs. These are his colleagues he's talking about, jumping off cliffs like Clemmings as they proclaim the political responsibilities of the critic. But eventually all this moralizing will subside. So what is the political responsibility of a critic? Bloom would say it's just to assess the quality of the work. But newer critics, younger critics, the emerging generation of critics, because Bloom he's recently died, and he was in his 80s. He was basically like situated in the Ivy League, a literal Ivy League tower of literary criticism, and he just like wrote books and spouted opinions and talked to students, and he didn't read any of his university's manuals on multicultural perspectives or anything like that. He was just not interested. Every teaching institution will have its Department of Cultural Studies. So he says, you can have a Department of Cultural Studies. Keep it away from literary studies, he would say. Reading the very best writers, let us say Homer, Dante, Shakespeare, Tolstoy, is not going to make us better citizens. That's what he's talking about with like these political responsibilities of literary criticism, and like you need to become a better citizen. So yeah, when you're talking about all of the important writers from the 20th century United States in poetry, they're all white men, but you haven't mentioned any Native American women. If your goal is to become better citizens, well, maybe you should. But he doesn't see that as the goal of literary criticism. He sees the goal of literary criticism as interacting with this canon, the progression of the canon. It's not going to make us better citizen. Art is perfectly useless, according to the sublime Oscar Wilde, who was right about everything. He also told us that all bad poetry is sincere. So just because it's sincere doesn't mean it's good. So what makes it good? Well, we'll learn that along the way. What is his perspective? He's got a really interesting, powerful, I think, perspective on what is good about writing, especially about poetry. President Clinton's inaugural poem by Maya Angelou, who he doesn't put in the canon. He says she doesn't. The canon, who goes in the canon? Ovid, Chaucer, Shakespeare, Beowulf poet, yeah, put the canon. Homer, Dante, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Ursula K. Le Guin. She won a Nebula Award for her book, which just happens to be right here, The Left Hand of Darkness. This is an award-winning book. Is it in the canon? Harold Bloom? No, it is not in the canon, according to Harold Bloom. Instantly canonical achievements. What he's saying is, like, in our world right now, he died in 2019. Everything is instantly canonical. Oh, this movie is so good. Oh, this TikTok is so funny. It's 20 seconds. Yeah, it's like, no, it's going to change your life. Are you going to remember it in a week? A week from now, you're going to remember that TikTok? You remember it in 2 weeks? Look at these dates. How about 2,000 years? How about somebody remembering some words that you wrote 2,000 years from now? That, according to Bloom, is what writers are after. It's what's driving the art to produce new forms, new creations that are worthy to be placed in the canon so that maybe somebody will care about what you thought 200 years. It's a form of immortality. Secular immortality, he calls it. Let's see what else I thought was important as I was reading this. We've got another page. Literary criticism is an ancient art. Cultural criticism is another dismal social science. Art versus social science. And I've made fun of social sciences myself because they just change so much. You know, even psychology. Oh, this is a diagnosis. You've been diagnosed with this official illness, which 5 years from now will not exist. You know, there used to be an illness that was called, oh my gosh, some kind of dysmorphia. But basically like what we call transgender identity right now, which is not problematic to me. I say, okay, that's fine. Your identity is really something that you work out as you move through life. So if you feel like at some point in your life that your gender is not matching your identity, well, you go for happiness. Go for what you think is right for you. Well, psychology that we're supposed to have so much respect for as a social science, I think like 5, 10, 15 years ago, that was a mental illness for which you could be diagnosed, treated, and cured. So how much trust can we have in these social sciences? Sociology. I took sociology in college, and it was always like, in a family unit, these 6 factors most important for the development of cohesive bonds are, and it's like, really? You just made that up. 6 factors? According to what? This is not science. This is not the law of thermodynamics. You're just telling me that there are 6 factors. Why not 7? Why not 5? Why not 3.5 factors? So that's where Bloom and we agree on that. Dismal social science, which is like, use psychology. I'm not saying it's bad or evil. I'm just saying you can be a little suspicious. It's not, it changes with the currents of society, and a lot of times it changes with the currents of where the power structures are in society. Foucault taught us that. Cultural criticism is another dismal social science, but literary criticism as an art always was and always will be an elitist phenomenon. So he embraces the elitism. It was a mistake to believe that literary criticism could become a basis for democratic education or for societal improvement. He's saying that is not the job. Shakespeare and his few peers, who after all invented all of us. I Better read that whole sentence. When our English and other literature departments shrink to the dimensions of our current classics departments, ceding the grosser functions to the legions of cultural studies, we will perhaps be able to return to the study of the inescapable, to Shakespeare and his few peers, who, after all, invented all of us. So it might take you a couple of weeks to untangle a statement like that. How could you even say that? How could a writer invent human beings? What's the logic that backs up a huge claim like that? It'd be kind of fun to investigate and see if you believe it or not. We no longer live in a society which will be allowed to institutionalize memory. So here he talks about the canon. So what is the canon? It's an institutionalized memory. It's us as humans saying, this deserves to be remembered. This deserves to be propagated to future generations. These ideas, these characterizations, this use of language. We need to teach more selectively. Oh, he goes on. I'm going to talk about this. Pragmatically, aesthetic value. Aesthetic value is like the sound of the poetry and how it affects, how it hits you. Just like, well, here's my sentence for this. I think this will help. Pragmatically, aesthetic value can be recognized or experienced, but cannot be conveyed to those who are incapable of grasping its sensations and perceptions. So if you walk into like a great piece of architecture, like the Sistine Chapel, or like, I don't know, just a great piece of architecture, just old, beautiful building. I think of St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna, one of my favorite places in the world. If you walk into that building, you need someone to explain to you why it's neat, why it's cool, why it's amazing, or is it something that should be recognized and experienced and like cherished? That's what he's talking about. If he talks about Milton, Homer, Shakespeare, those things, they're undeniably valuable and precious. Not everybody has to agree with that. Beneath the surfaces of academic Marxism, so these are all things that I teach these things. I value these things. But he doesn't. Beneath the surfaces of academic Marxism, which is academic Marxism is not saying everybody go be a Marxist. Academic Marxism just means that when you're reading literature, you're looking for ideas of class, economic systems, the distribution of resources and opportunities to produce goods. Feminism, looking at things like patriarchy, matriarchy, how are gender roles revealed? Are they reinforcing gender stereotypes that are negative or positive? That's all part of feminism, new historicism. These are different lenses. I made a video about intertextuality where we look at different critical approaches to text. He just sees more Platonism and Aristotelian social medicine, and I'm not going to talk about those ideas right now because I got to move on. Let's talk about let's talk about Ursula K. Ursula K. Le Guin. The operating instructions. A poet has been appointed ambassador. A playwright is elected president. Construction workers stand in line with officers, managers to buy a new novel. Adults seek moral guidance and intellectual challenge in stories about warrior monkeys, one-eyed giants, and crazy knights who fight windmills. Literacy is considered a beginning, not an end. Not an end. So I think that Harold Bloom would say that it's an end. It's like that building is complete. You want to stand in that building and be in that building. She sees literacy as more of a journey, as more of, I'll just read more. In the marketplace, the word creativity has come to mean the generation of ideas applicable to practical strategies to make larger profits. This reduction has gone on so long that the word creative can hardly be degraded further. I don't use it anymore, yielding it to capitalists and academics to abuse as they like. So this brings an important idea that is we fight over language. We fight over language and what language means. In politics, in education, in our own identity development, we fight over language. And she's saying, you can have the word creative, I don't care, but imagination, you can't mess with imagination. because for her, that's what literature is. Literature is a vehicle for the imagination. Different than Harold Bloom. Harold Bloom says, hey, look, if it's sincere, it's nice, it's fine, but like, who cares? Is it great? Does it deserve to be in the canon? Imagination is not a means of making money. It has no place in the vocabulary of profit-making. It is not a weapon, though all weapons... And this is her brilliance. Listen to this paragraph right here. I shouldn't interrupt it. I'll start again. Imagination is not a means of making money. It has no place in the vocabulary of profit-making. It is not a weapon, though all weapons originate from it, and their use or non-use depends on it, as with all tools and their uses. The imagination is an essential tool of the mind, a fundamental way of thinking, an indispensable means of becoming and remaining human. So this is her genius. It's subtle. You have to look for it. I mean, you have to it just comes on you with a very simple phrase like becoming and remaining human. Did you know that? Did you know that you have to actively take steps to remain human once you have achieved human status? As you change, as the world changes around you, you have to act in order to remain human, in order to recognize what's human and valuable inside of you. So that's what we want to look for. We want to look for that in these super old pieces of writing. These old pieces of writing in Ovid, written in 8. What in there is human? What in there is going to help us remain human? Same thing for Beowulf and Chaucer and Shakespeare. These are the big questions. The big questions that we're going to ask as we read these works. I think that we're reading the works maybe comes from Bloom, but the questions and what we're trying to get from the works is going to come right from Ursula K. Music, dance, visual arts, crafts of all kinds are all central to human development and well-being, and no art or skill is ever useless learning. But to train the mind, to take off from immediate reality and return to it with a new understanding and new strength, nothing quite equals poem or story. Poem. And we're going to be reading poems that are stories, epic poems, narrative poems. But look at this, the idea, to train the mind. You train your mind to take off from immediate reality, leave your surroundings, and in the case of Left Hand of Darkness, get on a spaceship and find yourselves in the wastelands of a frozen polar ice cap. Get some new understanding, get some new strength, and then return to your life. That's like magic. Now she makes a big metaphor, an extended metaphor on this concept of home. Home isn't mom and dad and sis and bud. Home isn't where they have to let you in. It's not a place at all. Home is imaginary. It's your imaginary home. It's where you know you belong. Your people show you how to imagine it. This is where we get into some of the readers we're going to be reading. They may have been dead for 1,000 years. They may be nothing but words printed on paper, ghosts of voices, shadows of minds. But they can guide you home. They are your human community. Ovid, Chaucer, Shakespeare, Beowulf, your human community. All of us have to learn how to invent our lives. This is the ultimate value of literature, how we invent our lives because we tell ourselves stories about ourselves. Do you see how much more personal it is than what Bloom was talking about? Do you see how much more attuned it is to you and what you need? All of us have to learn how to invent our lives, make them up, imagine them. We need to be taught these skills. We need guides to show us how. Without them, our lives get made up for us by other people. I'll stop there. I hope you join me. I hope you join me every step of the way, because I think it's going to be really, really fun. Next video, it's going to be on Beowulf, how to read it.